This isn't really a part two, but I guess it's a follow-up to my last video, and certainly some of the issues overlap. This one's going to be focusing a bit more on the issue of censorship and I guess to what extent expression can be curtailed, if at all, if there's any red lines. I actually think there is some red lines, and I'm going to lay that out in the video. But before getting to this, I came across a video that probably was more applicable to the last one, but I'll mention it here. It was a group of Muslim guys at Hyde Park Corner shouting Allahu Akbar, and there was a police officer, Metropolitan Police officer, and he basically told them to disperse because it was intimidating to Christians. Now, I think it's very obvious that Islamists have taken advantage of the free speech of Hyde Park Corner to proselytise and to spread hate in recent years. A while back, a Christian was actually physically attacked there. So I give this officer credit. I might put a link to that, although it's not directly linked to the issue in the video, but I might put a link just for a reference point. The police have come under a lot of criticism for alleged two-tier policing and not being consistent. Well, this is an example of an officer doing his job, and this is exactly what Robert Jenrick was talking about when he said using that phrase in an intimidating way, not just in one's own home, not in a mosque, but in a way that is, large group of men shouting it out. There's no need for that, and I'd be intimidated. I think anyone would, given that that phrase has explicitly been used by jihadist terrorists as well. So yeah, credit to that police officer. If only it was, more widely applied across the police. Censorship. So on the surface, this sounds like a controversial thing. It's something that authoritarian states get involved in. But actually, when you strip it back a little bit, is all censorship bad? I'm not sure that it is. Take, for example, certifications of movies, films. In this country, we use the British Broadcasting Board of Control, I believe, I may have got that acronym slightly wrong, but it's 18, 15, 12 PG and U. Now, common sense dictates that a responsible salesperson isn't going to give an 18 certificate movie to a 7-year-old, right? With good reason, because that 18 certificate movie is going to contain violence, explicit sexuality, swearing, maybe all three. So, there's a reason for that. The same with parental guidelines on rap CDs, for example. So both the music business and the film industry have a degree of censorship. I think there's reason for that. I think there's justification for that, namely to protect minors. Now, talking of minors, clearly there needs to be censorship around content online for children, because you don't want little children being subjected to some of the horrible stuff that's online, depressing even for adults, where you have parental controls and so on. That's a form of censorship, but it's a justified form of censorship. That's why I'm saying that not all censorship is bad. But when it comes to, when this overlaps into the issue of free speech, then it could definitely be questionable. Now, there's lobby groups that want social media companies to do more about online hate. I certainly think that the recent violence has shown that there can be a toxic influence to what social media puts out. Sometimes social media is unfairly scapegoated. An example of this is the murder of David Amess MP. I remember at the time, everyone was quick to blame social media. Actually, what happened was an Islamist had attacked Mr. Amess, and that Islamist was motivated by, Islamist ideology more than specifically information online. It may well be that he got some of his ideology from online sources, but the focus was put on the issue of social media responsibility and not on the issue of Islamic extremism, where it should have been. Again, I don't think this country is open enough about that subject. I think it's right that we're open about far-right extremism. I don't think we're open enough about Islamic extremism. I mean, I say we're open. I think the right is in denial about far right extremism. A good bit of the right, anyway. Certainly, GB News and other reactionaries. By reactionaries, I mean they're reactionary to the government's response, um, rather than recognising that there needs to be a tough line on this. And actually, Henry Hill, who's a conservative commentator in the Eye, he pointed out that most of the public actually want the government to take a hard line on rioters, regardless of their ideology. Um, that makes sense. Why would the public want anarchy? That's why I have a big problem with the likes of GB News claiming that rioters somehow represent the views of the majority, even if the majority wouldn't engage in that behaviour. It's a misconception. Um, but the issue of censorship, at what point can you say, well, it's okay to be offensive, but we better not censor that? I said in the last video, I think there's a difference between not giving someone a platform and censoring someone. If there's a company or a radio station or a TV station, if they simply choose not to invite someone on, you could argue that it's limiting the scope for debate. You can argue that it's limiting a certain viewpoint, but that isn't necessarily the same as denying that person a point of view. Why? Because they could go elsewhere. Um, I've seen people throw a tantrum when, it's this, like, for example, the idea that Trump was going to be taken off X, then Twitter, because he was known to be spreading a lot of false information and outright lies. And there was this whole almighty stink about, oh, Trump's freedom of speech has been taken away and it's a liberal elite controlling this and all this sort of thing. But I think it's fair to say that under Elon Musk, X has become a pretty toxic place. Arguably, it always was, but I mean, Musk has just got no sense of responsibility about some of the sort of content that's going on there. His attitude is anything goes. And yeah, he makes his caveat within the law, but he's not recognizing that by providing a platform to far right extremists, he's galvanizing them. Absolutely. Um, on the issue of censorship, do I think that social media companies have responsibility? Absolutely. And I do think they can do a lot more than they do. I know I've personally come across videos that are absolutely poisonous, should not be online. For example, videos that are showing a kid being bullied and they're not taken down. Literally showing, sometimes uploaded by bullies, showing a kid being bullied and it's not taken down. I remember there was a executive from, I'm not sure which company it was, it may have been YouTube, and I think it was a Channel 4 investigation. I honestly can't remember off the top of my head, but the journalist said, what do you think of this? And the executive said, oh, it's horrible, it's terrible. And then the judge said, so are you going to take it down? No, we won't do that. So, it's free speech. Yeah, I've been censored on Facebook, and I'm sure a lot of people can testify to this experience over something I supposedly said. Now, I think the context was I was forcefully defending myself from someone else, and I used maybe some colourful language that I probably shouldn't have done. But it's a bit like policing. I think there is an anger that social media companies are not consistent in how they regulate. A lot of people will say, I've been censored for sharing some information, yet Islamists, particularly Islamists, have got away with some blatantly extremist material online. So there has to be a consistency, and I do question how they regulate this stuff. Now, to be fair, I've come across, anonymous interviews, understandably anonymous because they don't want to be targeted, but people whose job it is to kind of regulate online content, and they've spoken about how thoroughly depressing it can be. Some of the stuff they have to come across. I mean, they're subjected to some horrible things, snuff videos, extremely violent content, all that sort of stuff. Absolutely, it makes sense to edit, censor, delete that stuff. But what I do think angers people is when, again, there's a failure to show consistency. Why is it someone gets censored, for example, for fighting back and defending themselves, and yet, I mean, the example I would cite is I called out Islamists who were celebrating the death of a Danish cartoonist who died in a car crash, and he had um, mocked the prophet. Now, whatever the rights and wrongs of that are, these guys were gloating over the death of a man in tragic circumstances. I called them out for it. I was the one that was sanctioned. That's rubbish. I said this shows the toxic face of Islamism. I didn't even use the word Muslim. So that's where the regulation online could be very inconsistent and questionable. Very. Another thing I think is appalling, and again, I got censored on Instagram a while back. No reason given. No reason given. Your post goes against community standards, and I was racking my head, thinking, what did I write? What was it that could have been offensive to someone? But clearly, it was something. To this day, I don't know what that was because they didn't tell me. Now, I think that's unreasonable. I think if you're going to censor someone, at least give the reason why. I believe that generally, if someone's charged with a crime, they should be told what the crime is. It should be the same principle online. This business of we're going to sanction you, but we're not going to tell you why is BS. It's evasive, and it just I think it's grossly unfair because it doesn't. I mean, put it this way: if you want to get moralistic about it, if someone has crossed the line and they're sanctioned for it, they don't even know what they've done. So how can they improve their behaviour? It's complete nonsense. Um, I did get my account on Instagram back after a couple of days because I asked for a review, and I don't know whether it was a case of they reviewed that and realised they messed up. I got no apology, incidentally, but it is concerning how they regulate the inconsistency of it. And sometimes I wonder, is it some sort of, it's not a human being doing that, it's some sort of algorithm or something, which to me is deeply flawed because it avoids nuances. How can you get, I mean, I don't know exactly how the technology works, but how can you get some sort of computer algorithm to understand the nuances of human communication? I'm not sure that you can. So I would much prefer human beings do this, but specifically people who are not going to be biased, are going to be fair, and they're going to do this in a fair way. Having said that, I do think there's a need for regulation and, frankly, censorship in some cases. I mean, is there any argument for allowing Islamist terrorists to put beheading videos online? You know, delete that stuff, it's censorship. But I think most people would say it's justified censorship. Why? Because imagine being the relatives of the hostage in that situation. It would be horrible for anyone to see, but imagine being the relatives of that person and seeing that. It's so I think there are circumstances where censorship is actually required. Um, and again, there's this extreme libertarian attitude, anything goes. I take issue with that because I think it negates to consider what that really means. But anyway, I'll leave it there. I think again the issue with censorship, like free speech, is there should be as much scope as possible for different opinions. Also, the thing about who what's the term, truth checkers, or yeah, who checks the truth of the truth checkers? That's not the exact term, but at some point you have to say, well, do you want a situation where anything goes? People can say whatever they want, post whatever they want, posting more relevant to the censorship issue. Um, or do you accept that there is some responsibility involved? I go more to the latter, but I think it should be evenly applied, and I think it should be a last resort. I don't think someone should be penalised for something minor. On the issue of comedians, I said in the last video, comedians are often talking very vocally about free speech. I don't think a comedian should be punished for telling, for example, an offensive joke. Um, but they have to accept that, criticism is also part of free speech. Now, why am I mentioning this in a video about censorship? Well, if a platform chooses to not air a comedian's sketch because it's deemed to be offensive, that's censorship. Is it justified or not? I'm not sure. I'm not a fan, for example, of retrospectively giving trigger warnings on books or on movies. I think that gets a bit ridiculous. It's, you know, if someone's going to be so hypersensitive that they're going to be triggered by what Roald Dahl or Charles Dickens has said, then it's just nonsense. Don't read it. I'm kind of okay with some kind of, not warning, but some disclaimer perhaps before Let's say you have an old movie from the 70s that is full of sexist jokes or something. I'd be all right with a little disclaimers in this film contains scenes that some people may find sexist, but don't block it, don't censor it. I think that's going too far. Um, but in terms of a disclaimer, I'm okay with that. One thing YouTube does that I actually support is they put a source to news networks saying this is a state broadcaster of China, of Russia, of the United Kingdom. They do that with BBC videos. I'm okay with that. That's just giving people some information. It's not censorship. It's just giving people a bit of context as to what the source is. What's wrong with that? It's not the same as censorship. Finally, there is one thing I think there is a need for censorship. I mentioned the issue of protecting children and so on. Another one that I think is important to censor is when it comes to national security. Now, what I mean by this, RT was censored from this country. You know, it was blocked from transmitting in the UK. RT was a mouthpiece of the Kremlin. Therefore, it was actually serving as a propaganda wing of a hostile foreign state. Now, some might argue that was an attack on free speech. For me, that crossed the line because RT proved time and time again it wasn't a balanced source. It was actively working as a mouthpiece for Putin. Why should they have a platform in this country? You know, Telegram, I think, should be banned because it is a mouthpiece of the Russian state. It's from Russia. It's not. It's one thing that it's served as a platform for far right conspiracy theories and false information, which is bad enough. But it's from Russia. Just people need to wake up and recognize this is not harmless. So I've no problem with something like that being censored because national security is involved. Why? Because a hostile foreign state is involved. This should be a no-brainer, right? I mean, this is not to say let's just ban anything Russian. That's not what I'm saying at all. But when I think if something's connected to the Russian state, absolutely it should be banned. Why should that have a platform in this country to sow up the seeds of division, to interfere with our society? This is not just asking questions. It's being used as kind of propaganda weapon. Um, that's how I feel about it. Um, no one can claim that the BBC, flawed as it is a mouthpiece for the British government the way certain Russian media outlets are for the Russian government. It's just no comparison. I'm someone who's followed extensive media for years. There's just no comparison there. The BBC has many, many flaws, plenty